Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're excited to have you here. We'll get started in just a moment at the top of the hour. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. Our discussion today is focused on how we pay family members in ways that help us to preserve family harmony. My name is Kristi Daeda. I am the president and CEO of FBCG, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator for today's discussion. And with us, I have two of my fantastic colleagues, Nicole Zeidler and Shawna Lecuyer. Hello, teammates.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hello.
In addition to their work with family firms on all kinds of matters of ownership, leadership, succession, next generation engagement, governance, etc., I'm particularly thrilled to have Nicole and Shawna here because they both have experience in human capital and HR and talent kinds of issues. So what we're going to talk about today is very much a family issue, and there's some pieces of the puzzle about how we build good systems that fit with the business's philosophy and strategy. And so Nicole and Shawna have great experience for us to share together, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation. I'd love to note that we will take questions at the end of the program. You have a Q&A option in your interface. Feel free to pop those in anytime. We had a number of folks who submitted questions ahead of the session, and we are looking forward to getting through a number of those in the program. But if you do not hear what you're looking for, we'd love to have those questions so that we can react to them at the end of the session. And we'd also love for you to know that this program is being recorded and will be available on recording for next week. So if you have registered, you will automatically receive an email with that recording in the coming days. Please look out for that. If you don't hear from us, let's say by the end of next week, feel free to follow up. We'll be happy to share this back with you. Before we get into today's conversation, we wanted to do a little bit of a check of the people who are in the room with us on how your family and your business is currently dealing with compensation issues. So we have a couple of quick poll questions. If we could put up the first. The first question is, how formal is your current compensation philosophy? We find there's a wide range of experiences here. We have options from we've never talked about it to we have a comprehensive philosophy that we feel is pretty consistently applied. So pick whichever one feels most relevant to you. We'll give that a moment. The responses are coming in fast and furious. Okay, just a few more seconds. Give everybody a chance to share. All right, why don't we go ahead and report back. Okay, so these are our findings. The largest segment of our attendees today, about half of you have said, hey, we've talked about this a little bit, but we don't have anything documented. That's probably pretty common. We've got a number who haven't talked about it at all. About 11% have a documented policy that they feel that they have applied. Shawna, Nicole, what do you see with families on this?
I think this poll really kind of illustrates what we see, actually, which is it can be all over the place. And every family is different, and every business may have its own complexities, some of which may require that you've gone in depth already with having these things documented, and others, it may come along later. So I'm not surprised by those numbers, and I don't think that there's any quote right or wrong. This is really about where do you start and how do we help you get where you need to be over the long term.
Yep, I think that's very true. It's an evolution. I think it's a journey.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes sense that this is our audience today.
Fantastic. We've got one more question. And that one is how well does the family understand the compensation philosophy? So some of you said you don't really have one, but for those who do, are you talking about it? How much do you feel like the family members understand what you've decided as relates to compensation so far? Okay, just a few more seconds. We can share those back. Yep. So we've got a little bit of a bell curve going. A lot of people feeling kind of towards the middle. We've talked about it some, we understand it some. Shawna, Nicole, comments on what you see?
Again, I think this is a pretty accurate reflection of what we see in our clients too. So that tracks with the responses from the first question.
Perfect.
Well, it also illustrates, right? We're here because this is an area where families recognize over time we may need to get into this a little deeper. So my hope is that through this dialogue, we can help give some practical ways of addressing that and getting your arms around it early before it does become a problem.
Yeah, fantastic. And I that practical piece, I think, is a big piece of what we're going to talk about today, right? It's a few steps forward and really kind of keeping it grounded in what you need most. So let's get into the conversation. I'm going to start with you, Nicole. You know, we're talking about compensation, which is one of the most personal topics in a family business. When we're talking about this with families, it touches on fairness, worth, identity, legacy, lots of different topics that are close to people's hearts. And because it's so personal, many families handle it pretty carefully, or sometimes they avoid dealing with it altogether. So can you help us understand why proactive compensation planning is one of the most powerful tools that families can use in protecting their relationships?
Yeah. So the instinct to protect those relationships by simply not having the conversation is totally understandable. Compensation is deeply tied to how people feel valued, how they to their worth. But in practice, not having the conversation, the silence and assumptions that fill it, they do the real damage to family harmony, not the actual conversations themselves. And then when families proactively create clarity around how pay works, they replace those assumptions with a shared understanding, and that becomes a really good foundation of trust. And compensation planning done thoughtfully is one of the unsung heroes of family business harmony. It's the quiet work and the process of putting a compensation plan in place that protects relationships that the family cares about the most. And what's great is you don't have to get it perfect. Even a small step towards clarity can make a big, big, big difference.
Very true. So we're going to get right into some of the kind of practical considerations. And Shawna, I want to talk a little bit about where families often start. A lot of families that we work with have taken a first step in thinking about their employment guidelines and compensation guidelines in terms of market rate, which is a good instinct, right? To think about how do we benchmark this against market. In your experience, Shawna, what becomes possible when families go beyond that initial conversation?
Yeah, I think what becomes possible is that clarity that we were talking about and trust, and then ultimately a sense of fairness across the family system. And market rate is a very well-intentioned starting point, and most businesses use it. But I think families quickly realize that it leaves a lot open to interpretation. So questions start emerging. What markets are we talking about? And who determines that? And how are increases happening? And when do I get to a certain level in the organization? And how are my promotions handled? And what happens if I get demoted or laterally moved? And so just saying market rate doesn't give the clarity that often, folks are really needing. And so when we don't define those things, we start filling in the blanks with our assumptions or our perceptions. And that's where these notions of unfairness start to take root. What I do know, Kristi, is that families don't necessarily need a perfect or highly sophisticated compensation system right out of the gate. That's not necessary. But when you start adding specificity around how your decisions are made, particularly when it comes to compensation, it creates a tremendous amount of stability, particularly for that rising gen family member who's maybe trying to determine if they want to join the family business, if that's the right step for them. And it also helps the business itself because leaders are no longer making decisions about compensation one-off or maybe emotionally, et cetera. Instead, they're building a framework that people can understand and they can trust and they can implement with consistency.
Perfect. Nicole, why don't you help us understand the next generation's perspective? Because a lot of next generation family makers are making decisions about their career, and compensation is a piece of those factors. So when a rising gen family member is deciding whether to join the business, what do they need to know that maybe market rate doesn't tell them?
So when somebody is weighing whether to leave an outside career and come back to the family business, vague guidelines don't give them what they need to make a confident choice. They want to understand, what will I earn? How will my performance be evaluated? What does growth look like? Who makes those decisions? So clear compensation information is actually one of the most powerful recruiting tools a family business has. It signals professionalism and respect for the rising gen, for their decision making. And families who invest in this clarity often find that more qualified family members are willing to consider joining. So compensation planning is a really powerful tool.
And you've seen that firsthand in families, right? Do you have an example of how that ambiguity has affected a next gen who's thinking about their career opportunities?
Yeah, I had a family where the son was considering moving back to the Midwest from to join his family business. And so to make a cross-country move like that, along with his family, right? Like he's uprooting his family. They didn't originally have a compensation plan, which made him really hesitant to make that move because he was using it as a signal of what the business is running like. So together, though, they did go through a compensation planning process, and they were able to put a plan in place before he made the move. So that helped it go a lot more seamlessly. His expectations were managed, and it just made everything go that much more smoothly.
Yeah, for families who want to welcome their next gens back into the business, providing that sense of security and expectations is really valuable.
Yep. And it led to some really neat conversations. Like the whole family got involved. So it could have been awkward, but it ended up becoming a pretty major bonding moment for them.
Fantastic. Shawna, I think sometimes we use different language around this, and one of the sets of language that we can use, we've talked a little bit about compensation philosophy or compensation statement. What do you see as the difference between like a compensation statement and a philosophy, and how do you help families understand what they're trying to build there in that space?
Yeah, the compensation statement is usually a fairly broad and kind of directional statement, like we pay market rate or we believe in fair and competitive compensation. It'll be basically kind of a sentence and it's usually directional. Whereas your philosophy is going to go much deeper. So it starts articulating your actual framework, the methodology, the guiding principles behind your compensation decisions. And a strong philosophy aligns your compensation with broader goals and the culture of your business. So it's not just about paying people competitively, it's about reinforcing behaviors and values and leadership expectations and long-term objectives that you're trying to build into your organization. Two totally different things. One is a little bit broader, one is kind of your concise statement.
Yeah, perfect. So let's get a little more practical on that one, Shawna. If a family wants to build a real compensation philosophy, what are the most important questions that it should answer?
Yeah, there's quite a bit that goes into a compensation philosophy. It's really the articulation of how and why your compensation decisions are made within the business. And it creates a really beautiful framework that I think decisions can be made within so that they're more consistent. And the consistency is so important, whether it's with family members or even with your non-family employees. People in general, we don't just look at this as financial, but as we mentioned earlier, it carries emotional meaning as well, right? So we tie our worth to it, and that can impact the way that we even approach our work or how well we're engaged in our work. So some of the important questions that I think a philosophy should answer, and by the way, I have a template that I use every single time when I'm working with families, and it goes through all of these things. So it made things like, what is your overall strategy for rewards, right? There's total rewards. Compensation is a part of it. So what is the role of your compensation program in supporting your mission and strategic plan? And how are we dealing with our market for our specific business? That's an important one. So market varies significantly depending on the industry that you're in, the geography, revenue, the company size. Where are you going to pay people in their salary structure relative to the market? So what is your pay positioning guidelines? Are you targeting the median? Are you above market for certain roles? Are you in an industry where maybe you have really tough to fill spots where maybe there's talent that's scarce and you have to go above market? Those things really need to be articulated. Do we incentivize team contributions? That's an important one. And if so, how are you going to do that? And then how do you determine variable pay components, like bonus? Is it purely discretionary? Is it tied to performance? Is it tied to team? Is it a combination of those things? And then also looking at external market data versus internal equity, because sometimes we have positions that may be remarkably similar across headcount or even across divisions. You want to have that consistency of like positions. So internal equity and external market data becomes important. So how do you make sure that that comp feels fair, both competitively and then also internally across your organization? I think it's important to include what role or performance plays in it. Is your base pay 100% impacted by your own performance, and your bonus maybe a combination of team and personal, or how is that divvied up? But people need to understand that. How are you handling promotions? What skills and competencies are needed before compensation changes occur? And then I think some of the logistical pieces are also crucial to include in there, like who administers and oversees the process, and more importantly, who communicates it? Who's responsible for making sure that everybody understands the philosophy and the program and the procedures are understood? And I think in family business, one of the most important questions becomes to how do we distinguish compensation that somebody's earning as an employee from what they might receive as an owner? Because when those two things become blurred, it becomes really difficult for family members to know whether they're being compensated for their contribution, for their ownership, or for both. So what I encourage families to remember in all of this is that it's not about building something that's rigid or overly bureaucratic. It's really about creating enough clarity that people understand how the decisions are being made and can trust the process behind them.
One of the things that I'm thinking about listening to you, Shawna, is, the importance of the why. So when you think about a compensation philosophy, right, the decisions that families and organizations make about how they're making these decisions are based on strategy, principles, values, those sorts of things. I think there's great value in making those underlying principles transparent to people. Like, this is how we make the decisions, and think about as families build those sorts of things, taking a moment to not just make the decision about the individual decision, but to step back and say, what is the principle that applies here? How do you see families dealing with that kind of, thinking through the underlying pieces of the puzzle?
I think the principles become so important there, because it's kind of the maintaining function that we go back to and say these are the guardrails that are going to guide the way that we make the decisions, and that in itself allows for that consistency that we mentioned, which becomes so crucial. So making sure that everybody kind of understands what are the underlying principles here. Even in the family business that I worked with for a long time, G2 and G3 had their own principles, and one of them was that we always look out for the long term of our employees. It meant then that a lot of our pay decisions, or our total rewards rather, were shaped by the fact that they had a profit sharing plan that was very, very robust. It was ahead of market, but that influenced some of the other components of our pay program, because we were following some principles that said we invest in the future. And so having those principles and having your HR team understand them, I think that it can be incredibly important. It allows for consistency. It allows the family's values to be operationalized effectively. And it really promotes that consistency that we had mentioned before.
Yeah, and what you've called out also there is the value of HR as an asset to figuring this out, like a strong compensation framework for the organization. You can build on that for family considerations. You also mentioned the importance of separating compensation as an employee and as an owner. And for people who are here today, a large few of them, asked questions around that. So why is it important to separate the employee and owner compensation? And for families who are thinking about that, how do they think about making that transition?
Yeah, this is a touchy one too. And one of the pieces that I often find interesting here is that we make assumptions about ownership, and the reality is you may not really understand how somebody's trust was set up. And so when we make assumptions around ownership, there are a lot of pitfalls with that, but the separating the two becomes incredibly important, because compensation and ownership foundationally are serving two very different purposes. And compensation is payment for work that somebody has performed, the responsibilities that they carry, the complexity of their role, their performance, the value that they contribute to the business in the day-to-day. And ownership returns, on the other hand, are tied to risks and rewards of being an owner. And they're connected to capital, to long-term value creation and success of the enterprise overall. And so when we start blending those two things together, families can unintentionally create distortions and resentment on multiple sides. So for example, a working family member may actually be underpaid because there's an assumption that distributions somehow make up for it. And meanwhile, the non-working shareholders may look at family compensation and make assumptions that they're overpaid because they're not fully understanding the scope of the complexity of the role. And what ends up happening is neither party is typically happy. So I encourage families to really think about this practically. If that family employee were to leave tomorrow and the business had to recruit externally for the role, the company would almost certainly need to pay what is the market rate, right, in order to get a qualified person into that position. So then it just begs the question, what does the family actually believe about family employment? So if their philosophy is that the business benefits from having highly capable and well-qualified family members working in leadership roles, why would we compensate them below what market says that work is worth? And so doing that unintentionally, I think, can disincentivize exactly the kind of family talent that the business is hoping to attract and retain. And particularly for that rising gen family members who oftentimes have many, many career options available to them. I think that one becomes incredibly important where we're talking about next gen. But over time, compensation then can start becoming a proxy battle for something much bigger, these emotional things like fairness and contribution and entitlement. So what helps tremendously is creating clarity around the fact that these are separate conversations with separate purposes. And a family working in the business really needs to understand how the comp is determined as an employee, how performance may impact that compensation, and separately how ownership returns are determined as a shareholder. And once I think families start separating these discussions, we often see a surprising amount of tension reduced because people no longer feel like everything is just mixed together behind closed doors.
I think we all benefit from organizing our thinking and sort of being able to categorize things and put them into boxes that we can work with together. So that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to move from here into employment guidelines because these things are very well related. So Nicole, we've talked about compensation philosophy and the why behind pay decisions. Let's talk about employment policies and how these things are connecting. What are the key elements of a strong family employment policy?
So a family employment policy is a good roadmap, an agreement on the principles and guidelines for the next gen's involvement in the business. So you want to have in there who qualifies as a family member under the policy, and that varies by family, and should mirror the family's unique makeup. Requirements for entry, like do you need outside work experience? Is there a level of education required? A lot of families have in there that you have to apply for an open position, that a job won't be created for a family member. Who supervises and evaluates family members? That's a big one. Clear job descriptions and performance expectations. And then how they get promoted. What does growth look like? And then what happens if it doesn't work out, if it's just not a good fit, both involuntary and voluntary exit. When you're entering into an agreement with someone, you don't want them to feel trapped. So you want them to have an out if they so need it. This becomes really empowering, not restrictive. They protect the next generation's credibility and give them the clarity that they need to succeed. So starting with a family employment policy, I think is really important in really carving out what that looks like.
And part of our discussion today prompts it came out of an article that the two of you wrote recently about these sort of questions of compensation and employment. And another piece of what you've written about, Nicole, was the value of sort of outside work experience before joining the family business. Why do you think that's important, and how does that connect to discussions about compensation?
Excuse me. So I think outside experience gives the next gen accountability from a non-family supervisor. So they get exposure to how other business operates and then credibility when they return. And then it gives them a sense of their own market value, which makes the compensation conversation much more grounded when they do come to join the family business. So families that build this outside work requirement into their guidelines often find it produces more confident, more capable family employees. And you can make mistakes without your family watching and then learn and grow before coming back to the family business.
Do you have an example of that as well, where a next gen member had outside experience, made them more successful, contributed to their strength within the company?
Yeah, so a fifth generation next gen spent several years working in an industry adjacent organization. And then he decided to come back to the family business and now is actually the CEO. So by working somewhere else, he was able to learn and to grow and again, make mistakes without his family watching. And then he was able to talk compensation based on his previous experience working outside of the family business first. So he cut his teeth elsewhere and then it made it easier to have the compensation conversation with his own family.
Yeah, it's an interesting facet of, when you think about market compensation. If you've been employed outside the business, you have some sense of what the market for your skills and contributions are, and that can be another objective source of information.
Yep, agreed. And I think it's this interesting balance between responsibilities. So if you have a responsibility as an owner, are you thinking like an owner or are you thinking like an employee? So that's an interesting juxtaposition, I think, that owners have to navigate.
Yeah. What about performance management? Who should be setting goals and evaluating family employees, and how does that matter in relation to compensation?
Yep. I must strongly recommend having family employees report to a trusted non-family supervisor. That can make for some awkward conversations around the dinner table if they are working directly for a family member. By doing so, this cultivates trust between family and non-family employees, and then supports objective performance evaluations. Sometimes we see family members not getting a performance eval. But when performance reviews are conducted by a non-family leader, compensation decisions then tied to those reviews carry more credibility across the organization. And it's not a family member deciding that.
Fantastic.
Kristi, I also think it's so important to give, if you do have family employment guidelines, to give a copy of that to the manager so that they understand the family's expectations and that they can support that next gen in fulfilling the obligations in that document. And that's another piece, I think, where those employment guidelines can come in handy.
Yeah, that's a great partnership.
Yeah.
If you've got great non-family talent to really enroll them in helping you with that development piece and making sure that it's objective. I love that. Appreciate it. All right, so we're going to talk about governance as relates to this topic. So you've got the philosophy, you've got the policies. How do we make sure that they're actually followed? How do we make them sticky? Nicole, let's talk about the family council first. What role do you think the family council plays in these kinds of matters?
Yeah, I think the family council can help communicate the family's expectations for family employees. They can be a good liaison and support for family employees to have somewhere to turn and some resources. Family council serves the crucial function of educating the family on those employment guidelines, compensation practices, and stewardship. So by using the family council in that way, it ensures all family voices are heard and that the processes are in place to resolve disputes. So the family council can be support and then also can be the enforcer if need be. So it crafts guidelines that align with the family's values and with the business objectives. And then most importantly, it serves as a forum for open discussion, fostering that transparency and trust that compensation decisions reflect.
So I think a lot of families wonder how this works in practice. Do you have an example, Nicole, of maybe how a family council played a role in the compensation conversation within the family?
Yeah, so it started even backing up before the compensation conversation by helping to develop and provide education to next gen family members so they can making sure that they are developing in the right way to be a good fit for the family. So the family council was in charge of they planned all the curriculum. And then the process was the interested family employee had to go to the family council first to share that they were interested in working for the business. And then the family council ended up helping navigate and negotiate his compensation package.
Interesting. Okay. I love the family council as a vehicle for sort of welcoming family interest in the business, right? To affirm that as a shared value. That's really fascinating. Shawna, let's talk about the board of directors. What's the board's role in compensation and oversight, especially with family members?
Yeah, the board plays a critically important role here because compensation at family business is rarely just about compensation. And so you'll hear the board oftentimes bring in committees, human capital, compensation committees, but it intersects with the development of leaders, with succession planning, with retention, with performance, with family expectations, and then ultimately long-term sustainability of the business itself. So one of the board's most important responsibilities is bringing objectivity and consistency to these conversations. And the board or its human capital or compensation committee helps ensure that there's thoughtful processes and appropriate oversight. So it also helps ensure that the organization is rewarding the behaviors and the outcomes that support the long-term strategy of the business, not just reacting maybe to short-term pressures or family dynamics in the moment. And candidly, governance structures can also provide really important support and protection to management. So there are times when compensation conversations become emotionally charged, and a strong board can help anchor those discussions back to what are our agreed upon principles, just like we talked about earlier. What does the market data tell us? What are the business needs, and what does our long-term organizational health require? I also think that boards play an important role in validating that career pathing and leadership readiness for family members. Particularly in later generation family-held businesses, those families really benefit from having objective oversight around whether somebody is really prepared for increased responsibility and compensation growth. But ultimately, the board's role is not micromanaging compensation decisions day to day. It's really to ensure the organization has a sound philosophy, appropriate governance, and then consistent oversight so that compensation supports both the business and the family system over time.
Fantastic. And you mentioned a little bit there, a human capital or compensation committee, I think. So for families who don't have that committee structure in place, what would you say about the reasons to consider forming one?
Yeah, I would encourage families definitely think about a human capital or compensation committee as a way to bring greater objectivity to conversations that can otherwise become very personal inside a family system. These committees also really oversee officer compensation, as well as overall programs that guide total rewards for your company. And as the business grows and your ownership expands across generations, it becomes really difficult to manage compensation and those talent decisions as a informal process or through ad hoc conversations. So what may have worked in those earlier generations often becomes harder to sustain as the family becomes, bigger or the business becomes more complex. So that committee can really create continuity around these discussions and help ensure that there's a consistent process. They make sure that your decisions are grounded in agreed upon principles, that the organization is stepping back periodically and saying, hey, do these compensation practices still align with the needs of our business, or is it preventing us from maybe going outside and attracting high quality talent? And candidly, it lowers the emotional temperature around compensation decisions when you're deciding them in a framework and with objectivity. So instead of compensation being perceived as a family member deciding another family member's value, this governance structure can bring process and perspective and accountability to the conversation, which is so crucial for family harmony. But I also think that these committees can be especially valuable because human capital is one of the greatest drivers of long-term enterprise value. And most family businesses have historically devoted significant governance attention to financial capital. But increasingly, families, I think, are recognizing that leadership development and succession planning and readiness and talent retention and culture all deserve the same level of intentional oversight, which is what a comp or a human capital committee can provide.
This is another area where I think an example would be really helpful of how the compensation committee, particularly when we think about that long-term value. Do you have an example where a family created a human capital committee or compensation committee and kind of strengthened their oversight in this area? What was the impact of that?
Yeah, we mentioned before that compensation and a number of these things, it's a journey, it's an evolution. And in this case, there was a family that recognized, hey, we're ready to go to the next layer in terms of oversight within our board. And they developed an audit committee, and then they, at the same time, created a human capital committee. And at the time, they had several next-gen members working in the business. And unfortunately, the broader family really didn't understand how compensation decisions were made. And so decisions and mistrust had started creeping into their system. And some family members started wondering aloud, unfortunately, if the CEO's children were being compensated differently than other family employees. And, the next gen, unfortunately, were also lacking some clarity around what was expected for advancement or how promotions were determined and how their compensation decisions were being made. There was just a lot of ambiguity all around. And so one of the first things that we did was we established that formal HCAP, Human Capital Committee, with clearly defined responsibilities through a charter that aligned with their bylaws. So there are other broader governance frameworks and board documents. And the committee itself was comprised of predominantly independent directors. And then the company's CHRO was the primary management liaison to that committee. They also engaged an outside compensation specialist who helped benchmark officer level positions and provided broader perspective around comp trends and incentive structures and compensation budgeting. So they had multiple touch points there with outside voices in the room that could bring some objectivity and also normalcy of this is what you would typically see in the market. And the change was not just about compensation itself. For this family, it was the level of transparency and process and objectivity that was surrounding those conversations. And they began feeling much more confident as a family that these decisions were being evaluated thoughtfully, consistently, and not some kind of informal ad hoc. We do this for one person, we do something differently for another. And the next gen also garnered greater clarity then around their career pathing and expectations, because in this case, HCAP had a hand in that. And so I think most importantly, the structure created a healthier venue for conversations that previously carried a lot of emotion and assumption.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the old adage that, in the absence of information, people sort of make up their own stories, right? And compensation seems like one of these areas where that's particularly a risk because there's so much about compensation that is confidential. So being able to be transparent about the process and how decisions are made is one way to communicate about compensation decisions while protecting sort of individual compensation information.
Absolutely.
We've talked about the family council and the board of directors at a human capital committee, which were all relatively formal structures. And there are lots of families who do not have that level of formality to their governance. At its core, there's a role for the family, there's a role in the business. So I'd love maybe each of you, and Nicole, I'll go to you first. What advice do you have for creating objectivity if you don't have that kind of formal governance structure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some families use they form a committee of family and non-family members to oversee hiring and compensation for family employees. And use your trusted advisors. Lean on your resources like your attorney, accountant, HR consultant, family business advisors. They can bring objectivity even without a formal board.
Yeah. Fantastic. Shawna, what would you add?
Yeah, I'm thinking back to, I worked with the family that I worked with for it'll be 30 years this September. And when I first started with them, they didn't have overly sophisticated HR department or HR leadership or a board that had a human capital committee. But what we did lean on was an outside compensation specialist. And there are quite a few of them that work well with family held businesses and provide great value. And what they can do is come in and help you really map out what your compensation goals and programs should look like and help with setting salary structures that have some consistency between midpoints, et cetera. And, they're bringing in outside information and they're also bringing in methodologies that are kind of industry standards that I think can be incredibly helpful. So even if you don't have that, formalized board structure oversight, there's still, tremendous value in bringing in these advisors that do this for a living. And there's some out there that really do a great job for family held businesses in particular.
Fantastic. Great. Okay, so I'm going to bring us full circle. I want to note that we're going to go to Q&A in a few minutes. If you haven't popped your question into the Q&A interface, I encourage you to do so. We already have some great questions in there, including about, I'm just going to give the presenters a heads up, some questions about compensation for board members and family council who are family members, which is another really important topic. So we'll definitely spend some time on that in Q&A shortly. But before we go there, let's bring back to this question of how does this connect to family relationships? We've covered a lot of sort of tactics and structures. I'll go to you first, Shawna. In your experience, what happens to family relationships when we get clarity in place around compensation and employment?
Clarity, sounds so simple, and yet in reality, it's often not. But when we do create that clarity, I think it can reduce a tremendous amount of unnecessary tension inside the family system because it replaces those assumptions that they're having with shared understanding. And compensation, as we mentioned before, it is deeply personal. So whether we intend it or not, people attach meaning to it around their contribution, around the fairness, around status, or even belonging. So when there isn't clarity, people are going to start creating their own narratives about why the decisions were made. And that's where I think mistrust and resentment can start to build. And it's not always because somebody had bad intentions, but because the process was just unclear or inconsistent. So when healthy governance and clear philosophies do create that transparency, I think family members begin understanding how the decisions were made, what factors were considered, what is expected, and where the lines exist between their ownership, their performance, and their employment. And that clarity doesn't mean right out of the gate that they're never going to disagree, but the conversations then can become far more productive because people are discussing issues with an agreed upon framework rather than debating perceived favoritism or the assumptions that they've made. And I think especially for later generation family businesses, that clarity becomes incredibly important because as families grow, cousins are raised in different households with different expectations and different experiences. You can't rely on unwritten rules and assumptions then the way that your earlier generations could. So the families that tend to navigate this best don't necessarily have the most sophisticated policies, but they are willing to have thoughtful and transparent conversations before tensions start escalating.
I
Yeah,
love
often
that.
the conversation is more important than the actual policy. It's getting to that end point.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicole, you work a lot with next gen family members, and we kind of prefaced at the beginning, but as we reflect on our intention to welcome next gens into the business, how does having clear guidelines change the experience of joining the family business?
I think it changes everything about how the next gen does enter the business. They come in with confidence, clarity, credibility. They know what's expected of them and what they can expect from the business. So building that clear framework now means the next gen inherits a system they can trust and build upon rather than unspoken expectations they have to decipher. This is important, really critical as families move from the sibling gen to the cousin generation, like you were saying, Shawna, for exactly all the reasons you said. They grow up in different households, they've got their own set of values, and they can't tolerate some of the same ambiguity that their parents may have.
Perfect. All right. We're going to go to Q&A in just a moment. But first, I want to do the question we always get in these conversations is, where do we start? So, Shawna, maybe I'll go to you first. If a family is listening to this and they're wondering how to get started, what's your advice?
Yeah, I would say first resist the urge to feel that you have to solve everything at once. So take a tiny bit of pressure off yourself there. I think that sometimes families hear these conversations immediately think like we need a massive governance overhaul and some highly sophisticated plan overnight. And that's usually not necessarily the case. So I think the best starting point is simply taking an honest look, what currently exists. And I would ask yourself, do you have employment guidelines? If you do, where do you still have ambiguity in there? And what assumptions might you be relying on? And are you clear in there with how decisions are made? And by the way, that means you also need to pull in your HR team to say, like, how do we actually do this in operation? Because as Nicole had mentioned before, part of the family's job is educating, not necessarily deciding how the business is going to make this function, but making sure that everybody understands it, right? So where do we have, open gaps where we still don't tend to understand that? And have we separated employment from ownership expectations? And do our practices reflect what we say we value? So I think those are some of the questions you can ask right out of the gate. And then you start prioritizing your conversations, particularly ones that you feel are most overdue. And I also, as I mentioned, bring in your HR person because these programs and policies, they work and they need to work holistically, not just for your employees, but for your non-family employees. So family and non-family alike. But for some people, this next step might just be clarifying what market rate actually means for your business and ensuring that your guidelines reflect it. For others, it might be creating more structure around performance or promotions, or maybe it's introducing more objectivity into your governance process. So I think that, I mentioned before I use a template. When I'm working with families, I pull that template out. It includes a glossary of terms, so we're all using the same language, and we systematically work through it. And it's not done in a day. Rome wasn't built in a day. But we go through each of the sections. What is our reward strategy? What's our compensation methodology going to look like? Who are our comparison markets? What is the pay positioning and those links to performance? How are we going to communicate the program to folks, and who manages it? And I think that kind of a document can go a real long way, and the family council then can leverage that and use it to share with the broader family if here's what this looks like. So when they are making this really important decision of, do I join the family business or not? Do I leave a great job I already have to join the family business? How is it going to work? And I also encourage families to involve both generations in that dialogue, because systems work best when they're built with your family rather than imposed on them. I'm sure Nicole has plenty to say about that as a next gen family member. And I think more importantly, give yourselves permission to evolve over time, because strong governance systems are rarely built all at once.
And you might not get it right the first time, but that's what's great, that governance can go through a couple of evolutions till you find the structure that works the best. That's the best fit.
Yep.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to go to the questions in the queue. Thanks to all who have shared them. And I'm going to start with that topic that I teased, because people are very curious about other forms of family compensation for board service, council service, and so on and so forth. So I'd love to open it up to the two of you. What advice do you have to families who are trying to work through those questions, particularly as we think about clarity and motivating people to participate and those sorts of things, as we've discussed?
Yeah, I think like in terms of a family council, it goes back to what are the values of the family, and do we pay for family member services, and I've got some families that don't pay their family council members that I've got. It's a kind of a mixed bag. Those about half and half, those that do and those that don't.
I always kind of refer families back to, what is your philosophy? And I think it's an important starting point, because if your philosophy, let's say in your business, is that we think that having talented family in senior leadership roles is important for continuity for our business, then I think you need to look at if they went anywhere else. And by the way, if they're talented and capable, they've got opportunities anywhere else, what would they be paid? And are you really willing to pay them less than that? And same for board service. It is an important job. If you have a fiduciary board, there's a lot of risk with that work. And they're allowing their time and their attention to be leveraged in this way. And I guess the question then becomes, if they're bringing value in a very meaningful way, whether it's in their family council or whether it's in their boardroom or in their employment, what would be the philosophy that says you shouldn't be valued the same as anyone else? And I would start with the philosophy. What is the philosophy there? And is it something that everybody can buy into? And more importantly, does that philosophy support where you need the business to go? Because I've seen some families, not believe that they need to pay market rate, and they've lost really healthy, solid talent to competitors. And I think you'd rather have your talented family members working in your business, not against it.
Yeah, I think about as family councils as an example, there's a philosophy in many families that says, like, the work of the family is something that we do as stewards, right? And we all play a role, and those roles may differ over time and over the life cycle, but this is something that we do because as family members, we're doing this together and it's good for the family. And then particularly when you see more sophisticated and when the workload is high, for that central family governance. We do see families who move to a compensation model because oftentimes younger family members, for instance, are taking time off to participate in family governance activities and things like that. And acknowledging those trade-offs becomes more important to ensure that you've got the right people playing the roles that you need. So.
Absolutely. But I think you hit it there too, Kristi, right? It's part of an evolution.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, I have a question here about what if we have guidelines and what if they're not being consistently applied? We created them together, we agreed on the guidelines, but perhaps they're not translating to all of our decisions. What advice do you have for a family in that situation?
I often ask if the guidelines also have a provision to deal with that, meaning, did we build into our guidelines? How do we enforce this and how do we ensure that it's done consistently? And sometimes that can mean that we create a separate entity. Maybe in some cases I've seen where a group of senior level non-family officers, executive level, have oversight on it and it's brought to them. And part of their job is to ensure that there's consistency there. So, the reality is you need to have some level of governance there and some kind of mechanism that we go back at it and we say, are we doing the things that we said we would do here? And are we applying it consistently or not? So I would also look at your documents to say, did we put in a provision that allows us to address that when we stray, or when maybe we forget that, hey, we've committed to this, but that kind of maintaining function. How do we keep this going and how do we make sure that it's done consistently? Equally important to some of the other provisions that you would put in your guidelines.
Yep, I think about it like routine maintenance on your car, that every so often you just need to do a double check. And it sounds like your check engine light is on right now and maybe needs some work.
I love that metaphor. Thanks, Nicole. Okay. Another question is, this compensation, formalizing compensation philosophy often is happening in tandem with a generational transition, right? So, a common situation is that siblings are compensated in one way, and yet when we go to that third generation, we know it needs to look different, right? But how do you bridge the practices, right? So if a certain set of family members are being compensated one way now and we want to make a move to a different model, how do you have healthy conversations about that? How do you think about that change management of how family members are going to be treated going forward?
I think acknowledging and saying out loud that you're shifting to a different compensation model. And it's just a different mindset too, where a lot of times we see in the second generation, all the siblings are paid the same because fair means equal, which doesn't always land well. So I think as you're transitioning into the cousin stage, that's a natural evolution point. That's a good turning point.
I would agree with that. I would also say that sitting down and recognizing what is the why, what is the impetus for this change, and making sure that we're all really clear on that and what's the end goal. Because if we focus on the end goal and then we start backing our way into it, we start recognizing the ways that maybe the current system isn't going to be sustainable. Mm-hmm. And it's important, I think, that if you look at the why, instead of assigning blame, you can start having those conversations and more fully and in a more practical way. And so it's really a reframing it of, okay, we've done it this way. It's gotten us to where we are. Nothing wrong with that. No harm, no foul. But let's look at where we're going and what is that end goal? And will this continue to be sustainable? And if the answer is no, then let's back up into what practical changes do we need to start shifting. But I think that looking at the end goal and making sure that we stay away from blame in that process is critical to be able to move through it with some harmony.
Yeah, we're solving for a future state together.
Exactly.
Right? And that may bring up some awkwardness and uncomfortable conversations, but keeping an eye on that future state.
Yep.
I like that.
That's where having clear job descriptions gets really important so that the compensation lines up with job descriptions. Yeah. People are getting paid for their responsibilities. That a lot of times when a compensation plan is paired with not restructuring, but professionalizing the whole business and writing some job descriptions and building out that function.
Yeah. I find that too, Kristi, when we go in and help some of these families, they may not have, as Nicole said, really clear job descriptions for everybody. And I think that that's critical because when you start looking at this, it needs to be a plan that fits holistically with where the business is going. So all of the job descriptions and how are we assigning kind of points or meritocracy to how it blends into a salary structure. Because typically it's both a combination of benchmark, but then it might also be a factor system that you use that looks at complexity of duties and scope of the job and confidential materials they may handle and how many people they're supervising. So there's a number of factors. And when you can map it out that way and show that it is a very clear kind of data-driven approach, I think it takes some of that emotionality out of it. Not always. But that's a crucial piece too, that we're focusing on what does the business need and what does the work require, and whether it's a family member in that seat or not. If we were to go to the outside world and try to fill it, what would that compensation structure look like? Because we're competing for talent.
Yeah. We touched on confidentiality earlier, and I've got another question about that. So, the question says, how transparent is it standard to be about family compensation beyond like the HR, CFO, and ownership? What if it's market based? Are there long-term values, risks, so on and so forth? So when we think about family compensation specifically, who's typically in the know on the actual compensation decisions versus the process and the principles?
I can share from my own vantage point. I'll be curious what Nicole's seen with her clients, but with the better majority of the clients I've worked with, they really have done a great job of trying to recognize that they want to normalize employment for the family, meaning like they want them to have as normal of an employment experience as possible. And if you worked anywhere else, would you know how much I made? The answer is no, right? Unless I chose to disclose it. So typically what I've seen is there's an oversight body, typically either a committee that's responsible for it or the board, et cetera. And part of their job is looking at it through the lens of, are they being compensated the way that the family employment guidelines say, right? Most of them will say you're going to be treated no differently than somebody else. So that's part of their job is that the case? Do they fall into the same compensation structures and plans, and are they being treated the same way as their peers? And is market data being used appropriately and consistently here? And so part of their job is just that oversight function. But from the better majority of my clients, they've transitioned into a more formal way of addressing that and also trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the family employee by not broadcasting to the whole family how much they're making.
I do have one client. The board reviews every family employee and their compensation, so they can provide a little bit of that, what you're talking about, that oversight, Shawna, without it being an awkward conversation with the rest of the family.
Yep. And so typically the Human Capital Committee will come back and maybe say, we reviewed this annually and we can tell you, one, your family employment guidelines are being upheld. The overall compensation philosophy and guidelines are being applied equally to family and non-family employees. Compensation is being benchmarked on a regular basis, and we can assure you that it's keeping pace with market. And performance is definitely a factor in it, and illustrating that there's been that appropriate oversight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it goes back to the value of objectivity. And if you have a human capital committee, independent directors, compensation committee, that is one source. But even, again, outside market analysis or a compensation consultant or working with your family business advisor and things like that, just having an outside view can lend credibility to the process, which is valuable for everyone.
Absolutely.
Right. All right, we are getting ready to close out for the day. There were some questions that we weren't able to answer, but we will have opportunities for follow-up. So we're going to put up a slide to close us out, to introduce, opportunity to follow up with Shawna or with Nicole. You'll get an email from us with the recording, and all of that will be available for you. And you can follow up with Shawna and Nicole directly if you have interest in talking to either of them further. If you have additional questions, feel free to respond to the email that you receive. We're happy to answer them. Or if you'd like to learn more about FBCG and how FBCG helps with these kinds of issues, there's a QR code on the screen that you can use to schedule a conversation with my colleague Claire, who'd be happy to talk to you about FBCG and learn a little bit more about your situation and how we might be able to help. So as we close out today, I want to first thank Nicole and Shawna for your expertise and for helping us to understand the very complex and important topic of compensation today. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Kristi.
And thank you all for who attended, who have stuck it out through this conversation and have been active participants in your questions. Really appreciate you joining us. Really look forward to hoping that we'll see you at a future program.